Good evening to all the attendees and welcome to today's webinar. Before we start with today's session, I would like to give you a brief info on Be Singular. Be Singular is a unique learning platform that empowers the next generation to create a real and responsible impact in the world by working with technologies of the future. We teach exponential technologies to make our next gen better placed to solve global great challenges. We also have a Be Singular Future Leaders Club, which is a by invitation club comprising of a community of young dreamers who wish to work together and help change the world. Be Singular Social, which has organized these webinars, is a non-profit entity that has been launched by Be Singular in collaboration with the Banyan, a leading child daycare center chain. Our objective is to invest our resources to help foster exceptional educational experiences and learnings for the families. I have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kaushal Kumbat. Kaushal is a CA MBA from University of California, Berkeley, and an alumnus of Harvard Business School. An out-of-the-box thinker, Kaushal is extremely dynamic with a practical approach to managing various enterprises across diverse geographies and cultures. Through his career, he's been an investment banker, owns several tea estates with his own tea brand, runs a real estate group, a mentor and an investor into several startups. Kaushal indulges in writing, and he has been writing on a wide variety and array of diverse topics. We have had two very interesting sessions, and we are really looking forward to this third session on writing our own story with Kaushal's guidance. Presenting to you, ladies and gentlemen, from Be Singular Social, Kaushal Kumbat.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for logging into this, the third session of the webinar. As always, I hope you're making good use of the time that you've had on your hands because of the lockdown, and that you're learning new things, picking up a new skill, and that you're going to make use of all this time. But of course, most important is take care of yourselves and stay safe. So, like I said, this is the third session. The first two sessions that we had, we dealt with the how and the what of creative writing. We spoke about the definition of creative writing and the purpose of writing creatively. We spoke about all the elements that go into crafting a good story, whether it was how you narrow down onto a theme, and then plots and plot ideas, how you create subplots, how you create conflict in those subplots, then characterization, the various ways in which you could make those characters memorable. How do you give them backstories? How do the characters create conflict between each other, conflict between man versus man, or conflict of man versus nature, etc. Then we also spoke about how you create settings or how you fashion a world in which your story is going to live. Finally, we spoke about dialogue writing and how descriptive writing really is the lifeblood of any story, and how you could really write rich dialogues, how you could make your scenes, sort of paintings with words. How could you paint pictures with words? We spoke about all of that. We spoke about the perspectives that you can narrate the story from, the three basic perspectives, the narration perspectives: first person singular, third person limited, and third person omniscient. So we spoke about all of that. In the second session, I spoke about how you can go about actually creating or organizing your book project, and the importance of work ethic, how you can incorporate that work ethic into your daily routine, how you should put in timelines on yourselves, but not make them too stringent, because then that puts unnecessary additional pressure on you. I hope all of that went towards helping you write a more effective story, and that you have benefited from the tips that I shared, tips from J.K. Rowling, from Lee Child, from Ian McEwan, all of those guys who got tips for aspiring writers. And we spoke about all of that in session 2. This session is what comes after. So now you've written your story. Now you've dealt with the what and the how. What next? How does it move forward? Because like this quote from Ernest Hemingway says, the hard part about writing novel is finishing it. I I wager that 80% of the people, if you ask them, will readily admit to wanting to write a story, but finishing it, that's a different ball game altogether. So today we're going to talk about how to polish your story such that it becomes ready for publication. And that involves two basic aspects. One is rewriting and the other is editing. So before we get into that, uh, you know, you've written your story, you've got up early, you've slept late, you've put in a lot of effort, you've put in a lot of you know passion into crafting your own story. But there's still work to be done. Having said that, time now to congratulate yourself, to give yourself a pat on the back, and to kick up your feet with a glass of wine and relax, because you've actually completed your small fraction of people really complete their books. So you're one of those. If you've reached this stage, you're one of those few people, and you deserve all the congratulations. So what is it that you should do after you reach this stage? What comes next? What next? First things first, let your book rest. What do I mean by that? When you've just finished writing your book, you're too emotionally invested in it. And like I said, you put in a lot of effort into it, a lot of passion into it. It's a good idea to take a break, not just because you've been working very hard on it, but also because at this point of time, you really won't have perspective on your story. You're too emotionally invested in it. You would tend to love every single word that you've written at this stage. But that can never be so, right? A good story, to become a great story, needs a lot of rewriting, a lot of editing, a lot of polishing. And if you start to do it as soon as you finish the book, then chances are that you will not be able to do a good job of it, because you won't have an unbiased view, a view which is from the top down, from the outside in. You won't have that view. So the best thing is to leave your manuscript for a couple of weeks, maybe even more, maybe a month, I don't know, and work on something completely different. Think of other things that you neglected to do while you were writing that story. Maybe catch up with friends, go out for a party, go travel for a week. And then when you come back, you will probably have a far better idea of what your story, where it needs to go next. So that's the first thing that I recommend that you do after you finish. Before we get into rewriting, the process of rewriting really involves, first of all, reading the story. I know that you've written the book and you're probably familiar, you think you're probably familiar with every word. But after this short break that you've given it, after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, print your entire manuscript and sit down and read it through. I guarantee you that when you read it, there are a lot of things that you will discover about your story. One is that some parts are absolutely brilliant, they're perfect. But then equally, there will be a lot of parts which are not very good, which are not worth including in the book as they stand. These are the parts that will need to be rewritten. You will find that you set out to say one thing, but what has come out in the book and what you've written is very different from what you set out to do. Those are the parts that need to be repaired, that need to be probably looked at with fresh eyes. As you read, you should ask yourself 2 or 3 questions to make that exercise more effective. And that is, from a perspective of a reader, what's missing? What is it that you can't uh, you can't put a which is not aiding the flow of the story? So what is it that is missing there? What are the extra elements to your story? Things that don't move your story towards the climax, towards the resolution, but are just there, occupying pages and disturbing the flow of the story. What needs to be rewritten? You'd be surprised at how many sections you will find yourself saying this needs to be rewritten, or I could write this better if I wrote it again today. So that's the thing that you need to do. Now, when you come to rewriting, actually, what is the purpose of rewriting? Why are you rewriting it? Is it simply to, sort of make your words sound better? Probably use a few 2-syllable words where 1-syllable words could do, or some showcase your vocabulary? No, that's not the purpose of rewriting. Rewriting really is to improve the structure of the book that you've written. It's essentially to say that this was my first draft. Now the second draft needs to be far better in terms of the flow of the story, in terms of what I'm trying to say, in terms of keeping the reader hooked. And it's not just about fixing the typos or the punctuation errors. That also plays a role, but not while you're rewriting it. That will come under editing. And before that, you need to complete your rewriting draft, maybe 2 drafts, maybe not just a second draft. You could also need a third draft. But this is where you actually have to sit down after you've read the book and think of the sections that you need to replace. You'll find a lot of holes that you need to repair, that you need to fill. You will need sections. You will find sections that need repair. All right. So this is a process that you can probably liken to chiseling away at in an archaeological setup. What do? You chisel away at the earth to unearth the treasures hidden below. This is something of that sort. You're chiseling away at your own words. You're refining them. You're removing the debris and the unwanted soil, so that you can unearth the gem that your book is, that your writing needs to show to the world. How your story will surface. In the words of Ernest Hemingway, like I said, the only kind of writing is rewriting. So these are some of the questions that you want to ask yourself while you are rewriting. Does the story grip the reader from the first page? If it doesn't, you've lost the interest of the reader in the first chapter itself. Very often I'll share an example from my own life. Everyone speaks very highly of Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. It is a great novel, and I actually have read it a couple of times. I find it very, very rewarding. But the first time I read it, the first few pages, the first 5 or 7 pages, perhaps because I was too young to understand the implications of what I was reading at that time, were so boring that they didn't hook me. And I probably the only book that I put down after reading maybe 20 or 30 pages, and I just couldn't go on because I didn't find it interesting enough. Later on, of course, I reread it and I understood what the writer was trying to say. But the short point here is that if you can't capture the imagination of the people, if you can't keep them hooked, then chances are that they're not going to go through with reading the rest of it. And you don't want people not to read a story that you've spent so much time and effort on. So is the story gripping enough? Sometimes it helps to think of whether you can change chapter 1, or you can substitute chapter 1 that you've written with maybe chapter 3. Because by chapter 3, your story has already progressed a little. There's already some amount of drama that has been built in, some amount of intrigue that is already there if you're writing, that sort of book. But, the story is meteor by chapter 3. So what happens if you put chapter 3 as your introductory chapter? What happens to chapter 1 and 2? Can you incorporate those as a sort of going back in time stratagem? Can you rewrite the story from a perspective that it starts from where your chapter 3 starts and then weave in the earlier parts into a narrative? Those are all options that you can look at. The other question that you need to ask is my story balanced? And is the pace, is the pace flowing? Is it proper? You don't want a story where there is one character or one plot hogging all the space, where the subplots have not been properly fleshed out, or where the characters have not been fleshed out properly or in balance with each other. You don't want to write a story like that. You want something that is properly balanced, where every character is fleshed out, where every character has something to say, every character is meaty enough for the reader to identify with him, for the reader to empathize with him. You should also ask yourself if the story is pausing where it ought to, and is it moving on where it ought to. Now, sounds very vague when I say it like that. What I'm trying to say is the action in your story consistent? Is it flowing well? It should not move around in jerks. You shouldn't lose the plot in transition. There is a story which is very, very slow and insipid till one point, and suddenly it jumps to a scenario where it's difficult for the reader to make out how you got there. The bridges are not properly created. That's something that you need to guard against. Like I also said, you need to guard against your reader's attention dipping. You can't allow your reader's attention to flag, which means you've got to have hooks. You've got to have a hook at the end of every chapter, as if you recall, that's what J.K. Rowling said, that every chapter should end at a point where the reader immediately wants to get on to the next chapter. You need to have hooks. You need to create a sort of a cliffhanger, maybe not a huge one, but at least for some amount of suspense and intrigue to be built at the end of every chapter. It should always end at a high, leaving the reader to ask, what next? You should also check whether your dialogue is dodgy, whether you've used a lot of adverbs, adjectives. Can you rewrite that portion? Can you write in a way that, like, again, I'm repeating what we discussed in the second webinar. Anton Chekhov said, "Show me that the moon is shining by showing me a reflection of it in a shard of glass. Don't tell me that the moon is shining." Right? So that sort of thing. Is the narrative sharp enough? Are you telling the story, or are you showing the reader the story? And finally, does the end come together well? Has the story been resolved to the satisfaction of everyone? Is there a sense of completion when you finally put down the book, when you finally close the last page, turn over the last page? Is there this satisfaction that yes, the ending is satisfactory and then there are no loose threads? Overall, if you can get answers to all these questions, you can create in your second draft or in your third draft a book or a manuscript that will take care of all these aspects. Then now you are ready for the next step. What is the next step? To get feedback. Who will give you feedback? Typically, people who've already written one or two books will have their own set of trusted readers or trusted friends, people whose advice and whose opinion they will value and they will believe in. For first-time writers, for aspiring writers, there's something called a group of beta writers. The beta writers will probably, you can access a group of beta writers through either a publisher or maybe through a literary agent, or otherwise, just pick 5 people who you think are good readers, will be able to give you objective feedback and send your manuscript to them. When they read the book from the perspective of the reader, they will be able to give you feedback that you as a writer would not have been able to see. They will be able to tell you where their attention did flag. What is it about the book that they did not like? What is it about it that they like? Did they like the entire story, or did they like parts of it? Did they not agree with some characters or the way those characters spoke? Those are the kind of things that you will get to hear from a set of trusted people who you send your manuscript to. Sometimes it also happens that there are a lot of suggestions that are thrown. Is it a good idea to incorporate all of them? Probably not, because then you would lose your individuality. The book would lose your personal stamp on the story. So you must include only those suggestions that you agree with, because at the end of the day, it is your story and you are the one telling it. So yes, it's a good idea to take feedback from a lot of people. Now, if let's say all of them have given you the same sort of feedback, that the main character is maybe too wimpy, is not very strong, is not likable, and so on and so forth, then that's something that you perhaps need to address, because all of them have given you the same feedback. But let's assume one person has said character is not really my cup of tea. That could be his personal preference, right? So you need to be also very careful about what feedback you will incorporate into the book and what feedback you won't. So once you've done all of that, then now the book is ready. The book is ready to take it to the next level, which is editing. So they also say, Stephen King, of course, says to write as human and to edit as divine. But there's another sort of saying in the literary world that says, write fearlessly and edit ruthlessly. A lot of writers will tell you to end up with a book of 200,000 words, they had to actually write 600,000 words, because that's the amount of rewriting and editing that will create a crisp story. You leave out so much of it to create a crisp story. But that's all part of rewriting. When you're editing your book, you're actually looking at it from a more structured point of view, in terms of catching the typos, in terms of weeding out the punctuation mistakes, the grammatical mistakes, all of that. Because believe me, there is nothing more annoying than a typo when you're reading a book, because that just tells me that the writer has not been diligent enough. It's just a lazy writer who's not spent enough time in editing his book properly. So even if the story otherwise is good, all these typos that keep creeping in will mar the reading pleasure and should not be allowed to creep in. You can either edit the book yourself, or otherwise you can get a professional editor to do it. Now, of course, if it's a professional editor that you hired who's doing it, you don't really need to involve yourself in the processes, and you can leave it to him. A professional editor typically will do a great job of editing the book. He's also one of the best friends that a writer can have, because while reading the book, he will also come to you and tell you where the structure is not proper, or where you've switched tenses inadvertently, or things like that. and you can correct all of that. So editor actually is a great help to a writer. But in case you're editing it yourself, then there are some couple of things that you need to be very, very careful about. So the first thing is that all of us tend to be quirky about certain things. We'll all use a certain word very frequently, or we'll, you know, tend to use a phrase very often. The way that we narrate a story is sometimes not, we're not very careful about how we switch tenses. We're narrating the story in one tense and suddenly we switch to the other without even realizing it, or your point of view of narration may go for a toss. You've started by making it a first person singular, and in between you've suddenly switched to maybe a third person. Now those are the kind of things that you need to weed out while editing. So pinpoint your most common mistakes, and make sure that those are taken care of, are reviewed, caught, and edited out. The other thing that you can do is use your computer keyboard, the Control plus F keys. So when you do a Control plus F, a search box is going to pop up. And in that search box, you can write your most commonly used words and phrases to try and get an idea of how frequently you've used them throughout the book. And if it's too much, then you can reduce that. You can also use that to catch hold of adverbs that you've used, adjectives that you've used, and weed them out. Those are important. So now you've rewritten the book, you also edited it. What next? Next is to find a publisher. The ultimate aim really is to publish your book, right? Because you want the world to read your story. How do you go about doing that? Most publishing houses today will accept unsolicited scripts, but let's be honest, if it is unsolicited, chances are that it is going to land on the desk of the junior most guy in the company. And that junior most guy also probably has 12 or 15 scripts to read. So who's to say that he's going to give a patient hearing, or he's actually going to read it properly? He may just read the first couple of pages, doesn't like it, toss it on the pile of rejected manuscripts. So the better way of trying to go about getting your book published is to find an agent. A literary agent is actually someone who's a writer's best friend. He's an advisor, he's a confidant, he's someone who will handhold you through that entire process of finding a publisher. And getting a good literary agent is a boon. Most publishing houses will give far more weightage to a manuscript if you are going through an agent rather than just sending it, putting it in an envelope and sending it to them. And an agent he serves both purposes, so he's connecting a publisher who's looking for new content, because this is a huge market growing fast. There are a lot of people out there who want to read new writers. So it's the agent is fulfilling that need. He's bringing in new writers to the publisher, so he's getting more content published. And similarly, the agent is also helping the writer, because here the first-time writer who wants to get published, who's written a good story, and the agent's job is to get the two of them together, helping both of them in the process. Getting a good agent, like I said, is almost it's almost as good as getting a publication contract. So who are the best agents in India? In India, the most popular literary agents are these. I haven't ranked them. These agents were ranked by Outlook magazine, and apparently these are the 5 most effective literary agents in India. So if you reach this stage where you've completed your story and you've polished your book, you've edited it out, you've rewritten it. Now you think it is good to go to a publisher. I'd recommend strongly that you go to one of these people and solicit their help in getting you connected to a publisher. So one of these, Red Ink, is also the literary agent for Amish Tripathi. The guy who's written the Shiva trilogy, Immortals of Mehilwa, that guy. So his book, his manuscript was actually rejected by quite a few publishers before he got into a partnership with Red Ink, and then the rest is history, as they say. So what will the agent do now? The agent will connect you to a publisher. India has several publishers, big, small. In fact, there is a publishers guild in India which will list out approximately 8,500, 9,000 publishers. Not all of them, however, publish fiction. Not all of them publish English fiction. So I don't know which language you guys are going to write in. If it's English that you're writing in, then your choice is that much limited. If it's Hindi, then there are certain publishing houses which only do Hindi, they don't do English. There are others which only do English, don't do Hindi, and so on and so forth. So these are the top publishers in India. Penguin Random House, probably the largest publisher of English fiction in India. And you'll probably know them from the kind of authors that they represent. So Penguin represents Arundhati Roy, the author of God of Small Things, and also Kiran Desai, The Inheritance of Loss. Both of the books were Booker Prize winners. So that's Penguin Random House. They're happy to accept unsolicited scripts. They also have they publish approximately 120 to 130 fiction titles a year. Rupa Books is one of the oldest publishing houses in India, and amongst the more prominent authors that they represent are Chetan Bhagat and Ruskin Bond. So Chetan Bhagat, as you know, is the largest, is the most widely read Indian author. So he's represented by Rupa Books. He's published by Rupa Books. Then Hachette India is not a very old company, but has actually done very well. They have been publishing for the last, I think, over a decade. They represent writers like Samit Basu, who writes mostly science fiction, and Tavleen Singh. And unfortunately, this is one company which will not accept unsolicited manuscripts unless they come through an agent. So if you want Hachette India to publish your book, you have no choice but to get an agent. Then you have the LF Book Company. The LF Book Company was started by David Devida, who used to head Penguin at one point of time. And they believe in quality over quantity. So they don't really publish too many titles, maybe about 40, 50 books a year. And they're also a company which does not believe in unsolicited manuscripts. So they have a target list of writers that they want to publish, and they go out and talk to these writers. It's not the other way around. So from a perspective of a first-time reader, perhaps the LF Book Company is not really of use because they don't take unsolicited manuscripts. But just for your knowledge, they represent writers like Shashi Tharoor, like APJ Kalam, like Vikram Seth, Devdutt Patnaik, that sort of writers. So August Company really. HarperCollins is part of the global HarperCollins publishing house, and they have been in India for a long, long time. In fact, the history of publishing in India can't be talked about without talking about HarperCollins. They represent some of the finest writers of English fiction. Arvind Adhikar is one. He also won the Booker Prize for his White Tiger. Kiran Nagarkar, Tarun Tejpal, These are books, these are authors that are represented by HarperCollins. Then you have Pan Macmillan, which is also part of the global Macmillan publishing house. They publish a lot of English fiction as well, almost about 300 titles a year. In fact, more than what Penguin does. But it's 300 English titles, not just fiction. So they do fiction, non-fiction, everything. One of the most prominent writers that they represent is Ramchandra Gupta. His book about India after Gandhi, for example. It's been published by Pan Macmillan. So when you want to send your manuscripts to publishing houses, there are a couple of things that you need to remember. In fact, before the webinar started, I was marking on the same thing to Shweta. One is you need to be very, very sure of the genre that you have written in. So, typically the covering letter that you send, or the query letter, it's called the query letter that you send to a publisher, should also mention the genre of your writing. And it makes sense to use established categories to describe your work, not to invent new categories. Creativity is not something that is a good idea when you're suggesting categories for your books. So, for example, if you've written quote unquote chick lit, it might be a better idea to call it young adult. Now, young adult is an established category, and so if you've written a book where the main character, the protagonist, is less than 20 years old, or it's a typical sort of a romantic book, better to call it young adult fiction. So that's one part. You need to know your genre. The second thing is that before you send in your book, your manuscript, you must learn how to write effective bio, an author's bio, a great synopsis, and a hook. So these are the three things which will ensure that your book is actually reaching the person it is meant to reach in the hierarchy in the publishing company. If your hook is not good enough, if your synopsis is not arresting enough, be sure that your manuscript is also going to end up on the pile of rejected manuscripts. So you need to know how to write a good synopsis in a good book. Also helps if you have a blog or a website where you have other samples of writing that you've done, or published work. If an article was published or a poem was published, it's a good idea to collect all of that into a website. So that's what you do. Now you also send your manuscript to the publisher. Now what? Sadly, several publishing houses will either not revert at all, or would probably send you a letter of rejection. I know it's heartbreaking to hear that, but that's the truth. A lot of manuscripts get rejected, not because they're not good stories, but just because they don't fit into the kind of work that is published by this particular publishing house, or they did not reach the right person, or maybe they've already published 2 or 3 or 4 young writers, first-time writers in succession, and they don't want to do a 5th one right now. But for several reasons, a manuscript might be rejected. Now, at that point, what are your options? Your options are either basically two. Either you keep plugging your manuscript to other publishing houses. Like, for example, these are not the only ones, right? I mentioned only 6, but I also told you that there are approximately 9,000 publishing houses in India. So you either keep plugging your book to other publishing houses in the hope that someone is going to take it up, or otherwise the other option is to self-publish. Now, what is self-publishing? Self-publishing means that you're publishing your own story. You're convinced that it needs to see the light of the day, that you will find a readership, that you will find an audience for a book, and so you want to get it out. And self-publication isn't settling isn't sort of what you do after you've been rejected or giving up. No, not at all. All it means is that you've discovered that your work did not fit into the kind of works that a particular publisher or maybe some publishers were looking at that point of time. Maybe some corporate marketer sitting somewhere thought that it wasn't really in keeping with the trend of what people wanted to read next year. And that is why I said no. But that doesn't mean that you should not get your story out there. If you put in so much effort into creating your story, into bringing it to this stage, then there's all the reason why you also need to get it published so that other people can read it, right? So, just to let you know, Amish Tripathi, like I said, was a self-published author, the Shiva trilogy. And look where he is. I mean, he's also one of the fastest and the widest selling authors in India in Indian English literature, fiction. So what do you need when you're self-publishing? You need to find a publishing house or a press who will help you publish. So these are the top self-publishing presses in India. Pothi, Become Shakespeare, Cinnamon Teal, and 24/7 Publishing. So now that you have all the tools, I wish you all the very best. And I hope that you do write your story. And when it gets published, don't forget to send me a book. Don't forget to send me a copy. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure doing these webinars.